Hi, welcome to the Ayurveda for Life show. I'm your host, Nadia Andreeva, and today we're going to talk about Panchakarma and cleanses with Dr. Scott Blossom. Dr. Scott Blossom is a traditional Chinese medical practitioner, shadow yoga teacher, and Ayurvedic consultant, and we're very honored to have him today as a guest. He has been studying yoga for over 20 years and teaching for 13, mostly with Dr. Svoboda, the Ayurvedic physician and scholar. In 2011, he founded drblossom.com, a site dedicated to Ayurvedic education, nutrition, and treatments. Scott lives in Berkeley, California, with his wife, Chandra, and 2 children. Well, thank you, Scott, for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to meet with you.
So we're going to talk about a topic which I think is close to a lot of practitioners and definitely to a lot of students of Ayurveda. A lot of people are doing cleanses nowadays. They're very popular and they're all types of cleanses. But again, we're going to talk mostly about an Ayurvedic cleanse, hopefully to help people to go through their cleanse or detox if they choose so. As a practitioner, what do you do to prepare and take into consideration when guiding a cleanse? I know you've guided quite a lot of cleanses, so you have lots of experience with that.
Right. Yeah. My background with using, Khichdi cleanses and that kind of thing goes back for, over 10 years now. And one of the biggest events that we ever did was we worked together with Yoga Journal and Banyan Botanicals, which is actually when we created the cleanse kit that Banyan now carries, because we had almost 40,000 people go through this kind of thing in like a one or 2 week period.
That's amazing.
And so, yeah, and it was interesting because, when you have that kind of potential audience, there's, you multiply the potential for things going wrong by that many people as well, and so what I learned on that particular event was how to simplify things down to a kind of a model where there's very little chance for people to, become imbalanced. They might have a little bit of digestive disturbance or their bowels might change, but they're not having anything major going on. And so I'm saying that kind of as a context to say that with the proliferation of online cleanses like the ones that I do, as well as people leading cleanses in their communities where they are actually in contact with people in person, it's really important to differentiate with what you can do in a clinical setting and what you can do in a kind of online or a more casual kind of setting. And so in a clinical setting, both traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda are really founded on pulse diagnosis. It really, it's the reading of the pulse that gives you the information so that you can make very distinct choices about what to use. And that in one of the things that separates Ayurvedic medicine from Chinese medicine and Chinese medicine from sort of a Western approach or a more Westernized approach is that there's less emphasis on symptoms. We take symptoms into consideration, but there's a saying, that one formula can treat 1,000 diseases, and that 1,000 diseases can be treated, or I should say, and one disease can be treated by 1,000 different formulas. Because depending on what the pulse signs are, you have to make distinctions, and treating symptoms often gets you into a situation where you're either getting less a benefit for the patient than you expect, or you're getting complications and side effects. And so within the context of doing Khichdi cleansing, I think one of the main things as a preparation for any practitioners or lay people who might be interested in this is that the process of going through a kind of Khichdi cleanse, while it will often resolve a whole range of symptoms, it's actually much safer from a liability perspective for the practitioner, as well as the perspective of a lay person who's doing this, that they're working with a medicine that it's based on creating a context in your life for balance and healing rather than chasing specific symptoms. And that whenever you make a change in your habit patterns of diet or lifestyle, you're often going to get into a situation where there is changes that are pleasurable and changes that are require some discomfort that go along with them. But when you look at the basic requirements like advocating more rest, advocating oiling the body, advocating eating a wholesome vegetarian diet, there's you can see that there's very little room for actually having caused an imbalance, as much as it's usually the process, if there is some part of the process that's difficult, that it's the body making its own adjustment. So I think in the context of preparation, it's very important to prepare as a practitioner to be aware of the limits of what's really appropriate to do if you're not going to be taking pulses and having a residential kind of environment for treatment, and also to educate the people who you may be working with in a Khichri cleanse around really what they're doing, which is essentially they're changing their habits, and they're changing some really major habits, so the potential for things changing for them in unusual and unexpected ways are there, but it usually happens gently rather than, in a harsher kind of abrupt way.
Yeah, and I love your emphasis on the habits, because I think you can change the food, but if the habits, emotional eating, overeating, eating with the computer or the phone are not changed, then the whole point of a cleanse is not going to be there.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and so what we've found over the years when we do this now, in fact, this very week we're having an online community cleanse happen with people from literally all over the place. And so what we've discovered, and we started doing it about 3 or 4 years ago, is to include a pre-cleanse period where we actually are just starting to have them do very simple, gradual changes in their daily routine, and then also including more things like having them make sure that they're hydrating really regularly. We're having them sip water throughout the day so that they're actually encouraging the function of their lymphatic system. They're also hydrating at a very deep level, which ensures that their bowel will stay regular or be as regular as possible during the actual experience of going into a more strict and simplified diet with the Khichri. And so we sort of specialize in giving them a bunch of wonderful recipes that make, they're moving toward a vegetarian diet, they're starting to limit the stimulants, they're starting to tell their friends and family and adjust their schedules so they have more time for yoga practices, for sleep, for general rest, those kinds of things. And we found that what it does is it signals to the body that things are going to change, but it's a very gentle signal. So when they do, we usually do this for 3 to 5 days, and then when they do shift into a Khichri cleanse mode, the body is already adapting to the changing routine and rhythm of their life.
Good. So the change is not abrupt, it's more of a slower, smooth change.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about the difference between leading a Khichri cleanse, or any sort of a simplified diet, versus doing a full-on Panchakarma.
Right. So Khichri cleansing is kind of a term I think that's really useful because it separates Khichri cleansing from even Purva karma. Because, for example, Dr. Claudia Welch and I were talking about this last year together, and we actually had a kind of a group call that we did where
it was a really good one.
Oh, right, good. You listened to that. Yeah, and we were discussing, about how in Purva karma, when you start to oleate and you're taking, graduating amounts of ghee, to intentionally kind of stifle the Agni so that the Ama and the dosha will start to move into the GI tract, there's a very powerful process that is quite counterintuitive that starts, which is you're starting to reverse the way that the normal nutrient digestive cycle works in the body, and that you have to be very skillful to reverse it into the right direction. And so this is where something like Purva karma, even something like that, is really useful in a residential environment where you have skilled practitioners who really can read the pulse and make subtle diagnoses about whatever choices need to be made to help a person go through that. Fundamentally, Khichri cleansing and Purva karma have the same intention, which is to balance the doshas, just gently bring everything closer to more of a kind of a balanced state. And then, of course, with Panchakarma, you're going into Shodhana, you're going into purification. And so whenever there's going to be vigorous purification, the potential for side effects, the potential for discomfort, the potential for a person going through a very deep experience that requires them to pretty much drop their worldly activities is actually, in my opinion, it's necessary. So doing Panchakarma outside of a residential environment is difficult. I really dissuade most of my patients from attempting that outside of a residential environment. And so there's a kind of a statement in the Ashtanga Hridaya about Shamana being Shodhana for Vata imbalances. So, the pacifying treatments are really the way you purify Vata out of the system. And nowadays, with Vata dosha being so widely increased, generally increased, Khichdi cleansing is, I think, a really ideal an ideal vehicle for introducing Western audiences and Americans, particularly to Ayurveda, because it's gentle, it's very sane. You're teaching people about balance and moderation, but it also is effective, and it has this kind of, it has a very useful purpose as something that balances Vata dosha via pacifying and soothing techniques. So it ends up becoming Shodhana for Vata dosha, and then it gently encourages Pitta and Kapha to be reduced. But if someone has very deeply held imbalances with Pitta and Kapha, then Shodhana is going to be usually necessary to really dig deeply into those things. And then, in my opinion, a residential environment is required. And so, overall, that's the way I would put the difference, is that Khichdi cleansing is really something that can be done while people are working, they can be in their lives, they can do it even online, and they'll often see quite a bit of benefit, and it will open up an entire journey for them about looking at their basic habits. And as we all know, all of us who study Ayurveda and apply it to our lives, that the Dinacharya and Ritucharya are really just pillars of how you really create deep, lasting health. And so they're initiated into that path in a very simple way, and it's inexpensive, and it isn't sort of too technical or complex for them to understand that they're really the ones that are determining their own health. So I think that's a wonderful way, reason for Khichdi cleansing being something that I still continue to do regularly with people, one-on-one and in groups, because I think it's just so valuable. And I remember when Dr. Svoboda and I talked about this probably 15 years ago, and we both decided this is something Americans need. So I went out and straight away started offering it in my community, and now, as things have gone, I just haven't stopped because I continue to see the benefits, and I also see how introducing groups of people to it, if you're a practitioner, is very useful for being successful as a practitioner, because then the people learn to trust you, they get an idea of what Ayurveda is, and they're more likely to maybe continue to work with you as a practitioner.
And it also seems like an introductory step to Panchakarma if a person wants to do Panchakarma at some stage in their life.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because it gives them an idea of, it seems so simple, you eat these things and you rest more and you oil, but where they get into it and they actually often discover that it's quite rigorous, and so it's like, wow, if that was difficult, then what is Panchakarma like? And I often will tell people that I really feel like they even need Panchakarma. I'll say, well, do a couple of, do a spring and a fall Khichdi cleanse as a way to give your body the message that you're going to be cleansing it, and then as you go into maybe a more intensive cleansing environment, your body will know exactly what to do to sort of go along with the process.
Great. I really like that. So what are some key principles to consider while you're leading a cleanse?
Basically, I think the most important thing to consider is that you want to make very distinct phases for people. They need to know, like I said, I highly advocate that you have kind of a way that you give people information about what they're getting themselves into and give them some things to get their supplies together and start organizing their lives. And then there's what we usually do is we have 2 calls a week that we do as conference calls to give people information about pre-cleanse, and then going through the pre-cleanse, and then we meet again and we sort of initiate them into the main cleanse period of time. And then once they go through that, we meet at the end of that, especially around the time when they may be doing some castor oil purgation or something like that. And then we do a finishing call where we really talk about rejuvenation and give them ideas about, that these, even inside of something as simple as Khichdi cleanse, there still is a kind of purva, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end that's very distinct, and that and that I think we're probably going to talk about some of the idiosyncrasies of different people, like different dietary needs. Some people may be diabetic, some people may have candida. You may have people that just don't digest beans and rice.
Exactly.
So you have to actually, so I've learned over the years to be very crafty around having a bunch of different possibilities for people who don't fit neatly into what a Khichdi cleanse will offer. And so along the lines of, what you need to do is you need to recognize that there's going to be a very wide range of needs, and there's going to be a lot of surprises that come up along the way. And so the other thing that I think is really essential is we give pretty much 24-hour support. When we're doing these things, we have a Facebook group, we have email, we'll call people so that we're really supporting them, and they know that they're never out of touch. If something comes up that's confusing or difficult, and even something like broccoli, somebody starts eating more broccoli, and then they discover that it has some kind of digestive disturbance that they didn't know about. And then you can be able to say, yeah, maybe it's the broccoli because we've seen that before. And, just using your own experience to really give people a sense of safety and having the space for the process be very intentionally held.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I do feel that everyone is so different that it helps to allow for that variety. So, you mentioned that you usually give about 3 days for the pre-cleanse. Mm-hmm. How many days would you recommend for the cleanse itself?
Nowadays, what we're doing is we're doing like 3 for the pre-cleanse and then somewhere between 5 and 7 for the main Khichdi cleanse. And then we actually are including a couple of days of what we call post-cleanse, which is a way to kind of, just in a structured way, get people into the idea about how to gradually adjust back to a more varied diet. And also it gives us time to really educate people a little bit about rejuvenation.
Okay, let's talk about this particular stage. How important is it to have this final stage?
Well, I think in my estimation, the main mistake that Western people will make with detoxification is to not rejuvenate enough. Mm-hmm. Like they'll go to India and they'll get panchakarma or something, and then they will leave, and they'll get on a plane and they'll be back in their lives in a week or something, and the body still hasn't really reoriented. And so even with something as simple as Khichdi cleansing, ideally the rejuvenation stage, in my opinion, is at least as long as the pre and main cleanse stages. So if we're doing roughly 8 to 10 days of cleansing, then 8 to 10 days of rejuvenation is a good minimum. And if they can do double that, that's even better.
So what would be included in the rejuvenation stage?
So traditionally speaking, there is rejuvenation with substances, and then there's rejuvenation without substances. And so with substances are going to be things like Chyavanprash and things you can actually take, or rejuvenative foods and soups, those kind of things that you're consuming to enhance ojas and build shukra, this kind of thing. And then rejuvenation without substances is all lifestyle based. And so it really comes in a nutshell down to really carefully maintaining the balance of Vata dosha for as long as possible. Like encourage people to get back into their lives, but also to really keep the structure and rhythm of their days clear, to continue to prioritize time for their yoga and spiritual practices, as well as, most importantly, to get enough rest. And for a lot of people nowadays that are sort of what I sometimes jokingly call on a caffeinated functionality plan, like they basically wake up caffeinated and they're great at whatever they do, but they do it caffeinated pretty much all the time, is that if they try to adjust that during the cleanse, that I really recommend that instead of caffeinating when they feel any fatigue as they get into the rejuvenation stage, that they do little mini shavasanas or just mini relaxations through the day, even 5 minutes, even something where they do a breath practice in a chair if they can't lie down or get in a more relaxed position. So we often have people sort of structure in times through the morning and the afternoon to rest, in addition to prioritizing 8 hours or more that they can be sleeping.
So it actually goes back to building those habits that allow them to maintain a balanced Vata dosha in the crazy world.
Yeah, that's right. That's another thing Ashtanga Hridaya says, is that the near enemy to ojas is Vata. So balancing Vata is going to, of course, benefit your Agni and benefit your ojas directly and indirectly by not drying it up, and also encouraging your Agni to produce good quality rasa so your tissues can be nourished.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the differences in the food itself, because as you mentioned, working with various people with various digestions, you've seen people who might not be able to digest beans too well, or who
Right.
might have blood sugar problems, and I would guess that those people would not be comfortable eating 3 times a day.
Right. So what we've done is, one of the strategies for blood sugar that we often employ is to have people use vegetable soups, where they're using actually mostly non-carbohydrate vegetables, and then something even as kind of simple as sunflower seeds or something to give it a little bit of protein. If many people tolerate quinoa,
Mm-hmm.
they can tolerate something like amaranth. They can tolerate something like buckwheat, which doesn't have it has a wonderful profile in it with carbs to protein ratio and
Amino
fiber
acids.
ratio. Right, where basically they won't end up getting blood sugar spikes from consuming what essentially is a khichdi spicing in a vegetable soup with those grains. And that's actually the same thing with something like candida, where I actually I have treated a lot of it in my career, and basically nowadays the body ecology diet is one of the diets that's really specifically focused on, helping with something like that. And so the grains that they consider to be okay to be used when somebody has candida are the same ones. It's quinoa, amaranth,
Yeah.
buckwheat, and then sometimes millet. And it depends on the person's taste. But really, I find that because blood sugar issues are so common these days, that just asking people to eat a very vegetable-rich diet, especially cooked vegetables and soups, with a kind of low protein, low fat profile for a week or so. If you educate people that it's not going to damage their health to go lower protein for a short period of time, because in America people are very, very sensitive about they have a very strong concept about getting enough protein, and so often the reactions to a low protein diet are more intellectual and emotional than they are actually physiological. And so we encourage them to to understand that their body, when they're eating this way, will actually be encouraged to burn through excess stores of fat. It will also be encouraged to go into a fat-burning metabolism, which actually regulates their blood sugar internally. So it's a wonderful way to start the transition to them having a more stable and steady metabolic pattern.
And they do still get enough amino acids if we include quinoa or buckwheat or amaranth.
Absolutely. There's a good point to be made for liver detoxing. The liver uses protein to process metabolites that are being eliminated.
Yeah.
So detoxification, protein is important, but when you look at something like quinoa or amaranth, if you're eating, a couple of cups of it a day, you're going to be getting enough to support the liver function. And if I get somebody that I would call more of a kind of Northern European or Russian, or somebody where it's very
Like me.
it's northern, yeah, like you, then I will actually say, sometimes I'll say, well, let's have you supplement again with something like sunflower seeds or pumpkin seeds, which are they're hypoallergenic. They're higher in protein. The other thing I'll use is sea vegetables, because sea vegetables as a vegetable are actually quite high in protein as well.
Extremely high.
Yeah, so it's a way to just encourage the body to go through things, with enough protein to support them, but it's also good for the body to be able to function without having a lot of protein for a couple of weeks a year, because my opinion about metabolic health is that it's the versatility of their metabolic system that's actually the definition of health, as opposed to the ability to find the right diet. It's actually, going with the seasonal harvest and various things that actually, where nature is giving you cues about changing up your dietary strategies, that the metabolic adjustments keep the metabolism and all the organs of digestion and assimilation healthy, because they're more flexible. They're learning, they're not just relying on one strategy for maintaining their health. And I have had a number of clients, especially in America, that are very protein fixated, and they're very fragile. If the protein goes down, they start experiencing various things, and part of it could be emotional, but there does seem to be this kind of, they function reasonably well, but if the protein levels drop out, they actually are very vulnerable to imbalances. And the way Dr. Svoboda has talked about it is it's mainly because too much protein is very vatogenic and pitogenic.
Interesting. Yes, pitogenic, I would imagine.
Yeah, but it's also vatogenic in the sense that the intensity of having a really high protein diet and the way that influences the mind with quite a bit of rajas is also going to feed into vata type of imbalances and the kind of vulnerability to instability.
Yeah, and it does create fear in people when they don't have enough protein, so that would increase vata.
Right, and that's just it too. When you look at the tissue layers, something like Mamsadhatu, which is its main quality is lepana, is it's a plastering, it's a kind of protective feeling, and so protein gives you this kind of confidence, but it's a little bit superficial, whereas something like bone, some of the deeper tissues, if the body is really regulating itself from a deeper layer, shukra, maja, then the person sees life from a much longer view, and they're just much more able to go with the daily fluctuations. And that's really, I think, how the yogis that employ very few foods and very light foods, very sattvic foods, that's how they're able to be very vibrant, is that they shift into a metabolic state where their tissues are being nourished all the way to shukra and ojas, and they're actually looking at the world from that perspective. So it's a very deep and stable perspective, as opposed to something like Mamsadhatu or Rakta or Rasa, which are fluctuating constantly from day to day. So if you're really identified with your muscle layer, you're actually psychologically aligning yourself with a very unstable tissue, and protein is the fuel. And so they're actually, protein mostly generates MAPSA.
Wow, I love this discussion. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Sure.
If people want to take a cleanse with you or want to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
They can find me at drblossom.com, and it's spelled out, which is DoctorBlossom.com. And I'm mostly focused on clinical practice now. I'm based here in Berkeley, California, and I have a clinic here, and I do consultation online, quite regularly. But mostly my main focus is in clinical practice. So they can email me, and I get right back to everybody, because I'm not traveling much these days. I'm mostly just here in the Bay Area.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. And guys, make sure to watch all other wonderful interviews in the Ayurveda for Life series.
Great. Thank you so much, Nadia.
Thank you.